Hey, welcome back. It's Yvonne Wakefield, my YouTube channel. And Arturo's saying I need to say I'm also a YouTuber and all this stuff is really new to me. But before I get into tonight's chapter 25, Yellow Rose in Babe in the Woods, Building a Life One Log at a Time, I have a cute story to tell you. So I have been teaching Arturo's daughter for 11 years, art. And she's a special kid. So whenever people I know travel, I ask them to bring back a scarf for the boys. A couple of years ago, she went to Mexico, and I said, can you bring the boys back a scarf? So she did, and that's the last thing I talked to her about. Well, a few weeks ago, she went to Hawaii, and she came to class with this wrapped up bag in Hello Kitty wrapping, and she had remembered about the scarves, and she was actually going into a market in Hawaii, and she found these little Hawaiian-made scarves just for the boys. So she remembered. You want to show yours, Zachary? So she remembered that. And so also, she's a really sweet kid, young woman. She got me a Hawaiian Hello Kitty, which is now part of my other Hello Kitty collection. So Yasmin, she's not only a good art student, but a good friend. Knows what I like. Okay, so we're going to recap chapter 24, which was Game Changer. So it's getting towards fall. It was late August. I go back to Minnesota. My brother's driving. I make some acquaintances. I return with a trailer full of furniture and a boyfriend. The furniture stays. I asked the boyfriend to go. And during that time, Jim was taking care of my cat. So I also want you to remember that this is audio, but this also comes out on YouTube. So sometimes I'll stop and I'll talk and I'll make some little interactions. And I know just if you're listening to the podcast, you won't be able to see them, but if you see on YouTube, you can. So, Yellow Rose, chapter 25. I'm not in the cabin yet, but it's built, and I'm getting ready to chink it, and I'm currently insulating it. So, I just have a quick sip here. All right. As with the tar paper, I buy insulation in rolls and cut it to length. Throughout the week, I staple pink fiberglass bats into space and then hammer a sheet of plywood over each 4 by 8 foot space in the loft ceiling and beneath the main floor joists. Whether on my back below the cabin or bracing a shoulder against a wall log, my arms quiver nailing plywood overhead as millions, billions, and trillions of microscopic fibers float down into my eyes, nose, and throat. New to working with insulation and plywood, I developed my third hand theory. Just use what is ever on the hand that works. Jim has always been my third hand, and since he won't be coming to work until later this week, I learned to brace scraps of 2x4 against plywood sheeting, freeing both hands for holding and nailing. As I lie on my back underneath the cabin and hammering, my celebration with self-sufficiency is sullied by the discovery that Tamarack, remember Tamarack is my cat, Tamarack has been using the cool, dry earth I lie on as a litter box. Only a week before, I'd been wearing a dress backward and sipping chilled Chardonnay at the Guthrie. Originally, to save time and effort, Jim thought we should use the butt-end method to lay walls. So this is where I'm going to stop. Butt-end is when you put your logs like this. We switched it after a tier or two to saddle notch. It's basically like a saddle that notches over the other log. The resulting methodology left 2 to 3 inch gaps between these tiers, the wall logs. After we resorted to notching, the problem of larger gaps resolved. But because the logs vary in diameter, the space between them ranges from 1 inch to 1/8 of an inch to no gap at all in the highest of walls. One book on building a log cabin advised driving in a sapling and chinking it over to seal the large space. Instead, I stuff insulation strips straight into the cracks, staple chicken wire over the most gaping spaces, or pound in and bend up 8 penny nails to encase the insulation in smaller gaps. On the porch, I use a 2x4 as a guide and slice insulation into neat 8-foot strips, frequently changing the blade of the Stanley mat knife to ensure a clean incision. I pretend I am working with cotton candy. The stuff is that pretty. I peel off the paper foil backing, drape lengths over my shoulder, and work all day, stuffing cracks. Insulating inside is easy because there's a level floor for support. I stand on an overturned bucket to reach the high spaces. Insulating the outside logs is a high wire affair, balancing on a 24-foot aluminum ladder. Fiberglass batting draped around my neck like pink boas. The days have cooled, and the asbestos fibers weave into my shirt, which I wear all the time, sometimes 2 at a time. I change into clean clothes at night, but continue to itch. Mesothelioma is not a word I've ever heard. By late afternoon, shadows darken spaces where sun played at the same time only the day before. I quit work by 5 because it gets pretty dark by 7. Mornings gradually get cooler, and when Jim returns to work that first week of September, there's a lacy frost on the grass just outside of the tent. I hear his truck rumble past my camp, and I run up to the site, stop at his tailgate, and wait for him to get out with Tamarack. Remember, Tamarack's my cat. He reaches across the seat, picks up a bag of cat food, and faces me. Damn cat. Ran away the day after you left him. Kept fresh goat milk out for him all the time. No sign of him, though. Jim shifts uneasily and appears to be about to put a consoling hand on my shoulder, but I turn and stare down the road. That means Tamarack has been gone nearly 2 weeks, and it's most likely at this point coyote scat. Just when I think my situation couldn't get any lonelier, it does. Throughout the day, I can't muster my usual banter with Jim, so I work by myself, stuffing insulation and hammering in 8 penny nails, bending them at an angle. I work at lunch, and Jim squats by the creek eating bread and cheese alone. You damn thing. Jim has climbed up the outside ladder onto the main floor where I sit, striped like a prisoner between shafts of light. I insulate to death. I do not look up as he bends down and gives me a bear hug, a caring gesture that nudges my vulnerability to the surface. I grit back to keep from bawling. After Jim leaves for the day, I go down to the camp and put the cat food in the footlocker. I do not bathe, eat, or light a fire. I unzip the tent flap, peel off my pants and shirt, and crawl inside the sleeping bag, itch, cough, and try not to think about my connection to anything, especially a cat. My parents are dead. My siblings float around like ash from an implosion of grief that never settles. Beside my grandfather, who breathes through tubes, the only relatives I'm not suing remain as distant as before. My high school friends are still studiously exploring burning matter. I'm pissed off by a system set in place to protect my welfare that allowed people to cheat me and the foster parents to bugger me. I've pushed away a boyfriend. My cat has run off. My life is as full of gaps, empty and incomplete as my cabin. I must sleep on this, the color of gray, like the mortar I mix and trowel the next day, and the next, and the next. Chinking is the process of filling up the open spaces between logs. It is necessary to exclude vermin and insects and to keep the cabin dry and comfortable. This is one of the most important operations in building a log cabin. The logs should be dry when chinking is done. Otherwise, you will have a job of caulking or re-chinking to do a year or so later due to the shrinking of logs. Logs and lumber, however, shrink only in diameter. How to Build and Furnish a Log Cabin the Easy, Natural Way Using Only Hand Tools and the Wood Around You by W. Ben Hunt became my new best friend indeed. The yellow-covered paperback took off where my first how-to book left off. It had practical advice and clear, easy-to-follow hand illustrations. First copyrighted in 1939, Hunt's book turned up on my most recent visit to a Minneapolis bookstore. Republished in 1974, it presented timeless advice to one building a log cabin using only hand tools and the wood around you. Clay, sphagnum, and oakum were common materials used back then, but Hunt recommended mortar because it withstands weather better than anything else. His recipe called for 3 parts of Portland cement, 3 parts of clean washboard sand, and 1 part of hydrated lime. Ingredients that must be bought. Before Hunt's book, my only experience with mortar was in mortar board, a tassel on top like everyone wore at the graduation, the high school graduation I did not attend. My new education with mortar has no academic strings attached and will become a monotonous lesson with a steep learning curve. Mortar, by virtue of climate and ease of availability, was my chink of choice. Jim supported this but advised buying it in pre-mixed sacks, 4 times the cost of mixing mortar from raw materials. To save money, I decided to mix my own mortar and chink the cabin all by myself. As with everything else about this entire building a log cabin idea, I had no idea of the means to achieve the end. I still believed if I persevered long enough, I could accomplish anything. This belief would be sorely tested during the final stages of building a log cabin, the easy and natural way. Now, instead of looking forward to summer and the prospect of building, I was anticipating winter's ominous approach and stressing to get the cabin chinked before the snows, or I went insane from loneliness and monotony. Instead of rejoicing in my independence, I berated it. Chinking only aggravated these pessimistic undertones. Mountain ash berries blink bright orange on the tree across from my bathing spot. Besides the dying embers, these berries, the first sign of fall, are the brightest spot of early morning. The thermometer by the tent reads 37 degrees. The air feels as cold as the creek, but the day is clear. By noon, it will be over 80 degrees downtown. Tank, remember Tank is my old green truck? Tank turns over slowly in the morning chill, its sludgy viscosity thinning as we descend. It's just past 7 when I gear down to second, exactly at the speed limit 20 sign. A quarter of a mile before the Chevrolet garage with a taxidermy polar bear in the showroom window. At 20 miles an hour, I will breeze straight through the only traffic light in John Day, gear up to 35 just outside the city limits, then hang a right and idle down at a chain fence double padlocked. Even though there is action beyond the gate, tractors and gravel pits in full tilt, the cashier doesn't get to her booth until 8. So I can't get loaded until the gates unlock. Janet is about twice my age and size and sits in a booth from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., Monday through Friday. Rain or shine, sleet or hail, whether it's snowing or hotter than hell, she sits in that variegated tin shell dispatching truckers. At 8 sharp, she unlocks the gate, and precisely at 4 p.m., she clicks those locks closed. In between giving orders and taking money, making change, cash only, from small loaders like me, Janet reads romance novels, sometimes 2 a day, she told me when I paid her for a yard of pea gravel the month before. My Timex says 7:25. Instead of waiting 35 minutes at the gravel yard gate, I drive back to town where there is even less action going on at this hour. 2 blocks before the polar bear, there is a rose garden, in front of a yard of a craftsman-style house with so many yellow, white, and red roses. Surely one will not be missed. Surely not this early in the morning. I turn off tank so it isn't rumbling when I go to do the deed. A freshly snapped yellow rose for Janet. "What do you think you're doing?" A pudgy woman wrapped in a pink terry cloth bathrobe lumbers out of her house yelling, "You are stealing my roses!" The woman stops at the edge of the sidewalk, hands on her hips. Her attitude is prickly as the stem of her precious rose poking between my fingers. A Kleenex falls from her sleeve. I could easily step from the sidewalk into the truck and drive away, but I explain, it's only one rose. Only a used tissue separates me and this sourpuss curdling my sweet deed. "It's stealing," she says, reaching over and snatching the flower. She turns her back, storms into the house, and slams the door. The Kleenex blows down Main Street. Maybe the polar bear can use it to stop a mummified sneeze, because damn if I'll stoop low enough to pick up the trash from a kindly gesture thwarted. Whatever happened to good morning? I shift into first, second, and third and park at the post office 2 blocks away from the rose garden. There's a letter from John. I want to open it in the vacant lobby, seal myself inside this envelope, and mail myself back to a place there was someone to give me a flower and a good morning. Instead, I put the letter into my pocket to savor for later. I still have a few minutes before the gravel pit opens. I could go to Emery's where there's time for a cup of coffee, except I feel really grubby and don't feel like talking. Or I could take a shower at the laundromat. A long, hot sudsing would improve my mood, except I didn't bring a towel or shampoo. I drive back to the gravel pit and arrive at the same time as Janet. "Hun, what's happened to your face?" Janet slams the door on her orange and white Pinto and walks towards me as I get out of tank. "I don't know. What happened to my face?" I rub my cheek. "Hun, you look all blowed up like a red ball." Janet unlocks the steel door of the cashier's cage, just a bit wider than her hips. Inside, she drops her hand-tooled leather purse on top of a haphazard collection of Harlequin novels. "Come in here and look at yourself." She reaches out, takes my hand, and leads me into a small mirror. Janet is correct in her observation. My face does look all blowed up like a red ball. My nose and cheeks are flush with the rest of my face. Having severed my head at the neck, anyone with imagination could stick fingers into my mouth and eyes and bowl a strike. "Here, hun, I got some Noxzema." Janet pulls a blue glass jar from her purse, unscrews the lid, rubs in a dab of mentholated cream onto my cheek. "You're having a reaction to something. Is it something you ate?" She doesn't wait for an answer. "That feel better, hun?" Janet steps back, gives me a motherly once-over. The cream feels good and cool. That's about all. The entire jar is not enough to soothe me. Something, I realize after looking into the mirror, is the insulation. Too tired and depressed to heat water to bathe, I've just sponged off with cold creek water for the last week. Nor have I bothered to look into the rearview truck mirror to see why my face feels itchy after working all day. Janet holds a black walkie-talkie to her painted lips, places an order for a yard of washed sand, and I drive into the quarry. A front end loader pulls up, tilts its bucket, empties it slowly into tanks as axles saw, and the bed sinks. Loaded to the gun wheels, I stop on the scales, get weighed, and pay for the sand. Janet hands me the top side of a triplicate receipt, her nails freshly manicured scarlet red. That's when I tell her about the yellow rose caper. "That's sweet of you, honey. You want to come in here for a cup of tea?" "Oh, no, thank you. I've got work to do. Maybe see you next week." She gives me the change from a 10. As I pull away, Janet says, "Wait." and hands me the jar of Noxzema. At the hardware store, I duck my head as I order 12 sacks of Portland cement and 4 of lime. Normally, I make it a point of showing the guys I can load my truck. This morning, vanity weakens any desire to prove myself in a man's world. I try to hide the fact that my face is a red bowling ball by studying Tank's retreads while the hardware store's owner's 16-year-old son slings sacks on top of the sand in the bed. It's still early. No one is at the laundromat. I put a quarter into the single-load top dispenser and palm a box of cheer. The Tide slot is sold out. I push another quarter into the corroded shower timer, powder my underpants, and scrub away those fiberglass spears. After 50 cents, the hot water runs the way of cheer. Another quarter gets me a lukewarm rinse. I use my palms as squeegees, my finger as a comb, and leave damp as the stall. I shake out my clothes hard to remove those nasty fibers. By the time I've discovered the letter in my back pocket has fallen into the puddle on the floor, the envelope and paper inside are wet pulp. But my outlook is brighter after the hot scrub. Still, I avoid looking into the rearview mirror where my underpants lay drying. Hey, well, thanks for listening to Chapter 25. Next, we're going to get into mortar. So remember, at this time at the cabin, it's about this time now, September. And the cabin's in a draw, so usually by 4:30, it starts to get pretty dark there, and the temperatures will go into the 30s. So anyway, we hope to see, well, we will see you next week. Remember to please ask your friends to subscribe to the video or YouTube and the podcast. And as always, especially now, there are so many more major fires right over near the cabin. I'm going there in 2 days. Stay hydrated. Have a good week. Bye-bye.